Great. Okay, hi everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Chris Sandbrook and I'm the Director of the Masters in Conservation Leadership. And it's a great pleasure to be welcoming you today for one of our regular Notes from the Field sessions where we catch up with one of the alumni from the Conservation Leadership Masters Program and hear a bit about what they've been doing and get an update from them and a chance to ask them some questions as well about their work. And it's great to see not only a number of alumni from the master's program and current students, but also a lot of other members of our conservation community in Cambridge and beyond joining us on the call. So thank you all very much for being here today. Our speaker today is Noah Steiner. And Noah, you have to remind me in which year you were a master's student. I'm afraid I've forgotten.
2016-17 cohort.
16-17, right. So approaching a decade ago. But still very much an active member of our community. Noah recently completed her PhD in Germany, where she investigated human behaviour and political dynamics in decision making, using the EU Common Fisheries Policy as a case study. Her research spans stakeholder network analysis, the influence of scientific and political institutions, and behavioural economics in fisheries governance. And she's had publications in journals including Science and Fish and Fisheries. Alongside her academic work, she's maintained a strong presence in policy engagement and contributed to both IPBES and the Convention on Biological Diversity delegations through the Conservation Leadership MPhil alumni network and supported environmental coalitions in Israel and beyond. Her professional background includes roles at UNEP-WCMC and BirdLife International, where she worked on international biodiversity policy, energy infrastructure conflicts with birds, and biodiversity safeguards in development finance. And her career reflects a sustained commitment to integrating science, policy, and activism for transformative change in conservation. She's developing new initiatives that apply behavioural insights and policy frameworks to ecosystem restoration and climate adaptation, including a consultancy project with the Ben-Gurion Institute for Climate and Environmental Policy. So there's a lot been going on in your life, Noah, and we're delighted to have you here and looking forward to hearing what you're going to tell us about today. So I'll hand over the floor to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the kind introduction, and it's good to see everyone and some familiar faces and names and new people that I haven't met yet. And I will start sharing my screen now for my presentation. So just in the meantime, I would like to say that I'm really excited to be here. We've been planning this for a long time, and now the opportunity has arisen. So I'm really happy that I can present some of my work. And of course, get feedback and do some brainstorming later in the discussion. Looking forward to that as well. So I'm going to talk about marine fisheries management. And I'm going to provide a bit of insights from behavioral economics and some case study from European fisheries as well. Yeah, so just the rationale of the entire span of my work that has been so far and where I'm coming from. So I started my master's doing hard field ecology, exploring arthropods in Mediterranean woodlands and the impacts of management. So I've always been interested in how implications of science can be used for policy and for management. So we were investigating arthropod communities in grazed and non-grazed area and cut and uncut areas. Then I was also doing a bit of restoration from fires. So I was working in the Ministry of Environment and again looking at how we can prepare for fires and recover from them. So we had a major fire in 2010. And in BirdLife, as Chris said, I was working in the interface between decision making and trying to put biodiversity standards and considerations into planning. So that's a bit further apart. And then I went into fisheries as a case study because I was thinking, with all the terrestrial work that we've been doing and the value of nature, both economically, we needed to explain it and we needed to make the economical case sometimes in the ministry and of course, beyond the intrinsic value. But here in fisheries, I saw an opportunity to better understand when you have the economic base ready and understood by everyone. You cannot have a fishery in a collapsed setting. If there is no fish, there is no fishery. So I was trying to understand how even in Europe, in some cases, things are not working, and even when the economic case is clear. So all this work about valuing nature and assuming that once we have a value of nature, everything will work. In fisheries, it's not necessarily the case. So I thought it would be a good case study for better understanding how to make a good decision making for the longer term. So I see some of you that are in fisheries management, so I will not, and fisheries in general, so I will not go into much details on this. But when we look at fisheries and fish in general and the ocean, we know that when you fish down the food web, when you get a depletion of predatory species and collapsed stocks become commercially extinct, even if they're not completely extinct, this is a clear economical case that you don't have fish that you can fish with high profit. Of course, there are further implications rather than just economical. We have less diverse seas, then lower ecosystem resilience and lower ocean socioeconomical resilience. And these are things that are still trying to be understood in many arenas, including science. Global status of overfishing. We can see from FAO data that overfish stocks are actually increasing since the 1970s. And they are in proportion currently 37.7%. If you look at FAO definitions, maximally sustainable fish, underfish, it's not my definition, it's the FAO. I'm not particularly fond of it, but it's not looking good. We're not getting better. That's globally. However, it does vary across regions. And the region that I study actually has an opposite trend. We have reduced overfishing over time. So we started with the 2000s and with about 75% of overfished stocks, and it is getting better. But we do have a stagnation since the major last reform in 2013. There is a stagnation in the status of the overfished stocks, that's including biomass. We do see some positive trend of decreased overfishing of the fishing mortality, of what happens with the fishers in the field, how much they fish beyond maximum sustainable yield. But we still don't see it necessarily in the biomass recovery. But it could be a positive trend in the future. However, we're still around 30% of overfished stock. So my question was, why? So this is my PhD dissertation, which I just presented last month, and it will be published, I guess, in the next few months. So if anyone is interested, I can also send you a version. And I will present like a small part of it. Systemic failure of European fisheries management. This was a paper that colleagues from GeoMar have led. And I really appreciate working with these wonderful people. We took the Western Baltic as a case study, and the key messages of what we found, that we first found that there is a failure in the knowledge, in the models, and in how the estimation of the stocks. There was overestimation, and I will show you in a minute. And there was also management failure, so not precautionary enough. And I will also discuss this in a bit. You can see in the Baltic, in the Western Baltic, there was a sharp decrease in biomass of the major predatory fish, the cod, and also the disappearance of key species such as sprat and herring. If you look only at the cod, you can see that from 2003 to 2012, there was actually a good estimation of the status of the stock. However, you see all these going ups, and where it goes up, it means that there was an overestimation of the science at the time. They thought the stock would actually increase in biomass, but then the next year or the next years, they corrected it because it didn't go up. And again, this happened in 2018, 2019, 2020, and even now there's an overestimation of how high the stock is. This year, I think they've advised zero catch because the stock has collapsed commercially, not extinct. There are still cod in the Baltic. However, we can see that there's a systematic overestimation, which may influence also the decision-making process if the stakeholders and the policymakers believe that the stock is going up. And we call it phantom recoveries. It's also based on a paper by Edgar et al., who found it also in global fisheries, not only in the Baltic. Another term that we've coined in this science paper is the overfishing ratchet. So science overestimates the biomass, and then the European Commission proposes a quota. They're using mostly a policy instrument of quota and not effort. So the quota is higher than the scientific advice, and then the council decision is higher than the quota. So you can see it's a little messy, but the proposed catch in orange, and then the council decision. And actually what we find in the total catch, the fishers are not really catching more than what the council allows them to do. But it's mostly because they can't, because the quotas are so high that they just, it's sometimes in some years, not all years, but in some years it's mostly unregulated fishery because the quota is so high that the fishermen cannot even catch it commercially. So some of the recommendations that we see on ways forward in the Baltic is that we need more precautionary science and more robust scientific institutions and advice mechanisms. We also highlight the fact that in some cases that was not systemic, but we identified some cases that the national scientific institutions have advised even higher quotas than the scientific advice. But this was not systemic, that was anecdotal finding. And we also propose ecosystem-based fisheries management harvest control rules, which are not applied currently in the Baltic Sea and in the North Sea. They're using different approaches from Australia and the US in Europe. So we need to make it more robust also to species interactions, because they're using single stock species assessments, but they're not looking at the interactions. So what we're saying is that forage fish should be fished even less because they're the basis of the food web. And this can be found also in the paper and in the supplementary material. I really recommend it. So some other chapters in my dissertation are discussing the drivers of overfishing in the Baltic Sea. In the literature, you can find the tragedy of the commons as one of the drivers, and free riding or a high discount rate where you prefer profit now over profit later. But in this specific case, it might be some parts of it, but it cannot explain the full picture, because the EU Common Fishery Policy has been established policy, and we have governance in place. The fishers cannot just do what they want. It is regulated since the 1970s. There have been some major reform, and we have a European Common Fisheries Policy in place since 1983, which is just 1 year after the UN Law of the Sea was approved. And we do see investment in fisheries of the future by the EU institutions. They want to develop fishing vessels of the future. They're investing in energy transition of the current boats, and they're investing in generational renewal, so bringing more young fishermen on board and not letting the population grow old. So one of the things that we have examined, and I have done some analysis in my dissertation, is the issue of beliefs and biased beliefs. So when you get information signals, you observe and you interpret it by your own beliefs. And you also look at communication learning, so what others around you that you trust are saying. So both observational and communication learning. And of course, it depends on how close you are to the people in power and power dynamics. And then it goes into policy decision, and then there's impact on both the fish and the fishery and socioeconomic impacts. So there may be politicization of these narratives and politicization of specific policy instruments as well. And what we call for is that we need to better understand how belief updating and how people do observational and communication learning in order to enhance adaptive learning processes. So for example, in the Baltic Sea, every year the ministers put the same press release that they've made a balanced decision, although some of their decisions are actually political overfishing. So for example, here he says the livelihood of fishers depend on long-term sustainability of our fishing stocks, that he recognizes. With today's agreement, we aim to strike a balance between helping fish stocks recover, protecting marine ecosystems, and ensuring the viability of the sectors in the future. So I've examined a little bit what they call balance, how they balance, and one of the ways that they balance is also using balance of policy instruments, for example, higher quotas, but we do more closures or specific spawning closures. But for some of the policy instruments that they're using, they don't necessarily have the information on how to translate it to increased or decreased quotas. So you get a balanced equation that is not evidence-based. So this also needs to change and improve. And when we talk about beliefs, we need to also think about behavioral mechanisms in general, and what drives those beliefs may also depend on behavioral mechanisms. So I was in a conference and I saw a presentation by Amanda, and they presented a pre-registered protocol that they're going to do for a systematic review, and I found it fascinating, and I joined on board. And it took a few years, but we published this paper called Behavioral Economics in Marine Fisheries Management, a systematic review. And first of all, we tried to define what behavioral economics means, and we categorized three main issues that you can define it. So first, the traditional economics assumes rational actor model that makes optimal decisions based on highest expected payoff, profit, etc., welfare. But in behavioral economics, you combine insights from psychology, neuroscience, sociology, and decision-making theory to understand why people do not always behave according to the rational actor model. So we divided the papers that we found into three main categories: social mechanisms, how we're influenced by others, but also cognitive biases and risk loss time preferences. And these are more individual-based decisions. So this is from the pre-registered protocol. We had a specific protocol on what we are looking for. We looked specifically for fisheries and fishers papers. So this was bottom down, bottom up. if before I looked into more of the political elite and who makes the decisions and who are the stakeholders involved trying to influence the decision, here we went really to the fishers, and we looked at interventions, experiments, and behavioral mechanisms that were specific and were found through these strings. And our methodological approach was to look at the research paper focus. So although we thought we would find more intervention papers, we did find 54 papers. We also found that papers that are talking about understanding a specific behavioral mechanism related to fisheries issue, or incidental findings. So for example, in the discussion, there was a paper not related to anything of behavioral economics, but in the discussion they say, oh, our results on the divers may be related to a specific behavior. So this we found in about 29 papers, and we call them incidental findings. Oh, sorry, the conceptual framework. So we looked at the intervention or the behavioral mechanism. And then we looked into the behavior change that it was supposed to activate, the observed outcomes, as well as the unintended consequences, which we did find, and not a lot, but we did find some. And then we also looked at the paper's research recommendations and policy recommendations. We found that social mechanisms were the most prominent in most regions. Cognitive biases were second. In some places, it was more than others, like in Asia. So this is only what we found in the literature. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the most important thing, but that's what's being most studied. And then the risk loss and time preference was found in 43 papers. And you can see in Europe, it was explored less than the others on social norms, etc. We also found a geographical bias in general in the 54 papers that were specific on interventions. So you see that there are a lot more studies in North America and in Australia and South America than in the rest of the world, even in Europe. One of the reasons is that perhaps more economical studies are prevailing rather than looking at the behavior itself. And also the distribution of researchers that are doing behavioral economics in fisheries. It's not a lot of researchers, so I guess this could also explain some of the biases. We found also a bias in what they're studying, so it's more biased towards small scale and artisanal fisheries. The large scale are less studies in terms of behavior as well as the recreational, and most studies were on hooks, lines, and nets, or general. Yeah, so some of them were unknown, a lot of them. But from what we've identified, the hooks and lines were the most. So we also find a bias because larger scale fisheries, which have a large impact, also trawls, there are less studies in terms of behavioral economics. The categories that we've identified for the intervention that we found in the literature from the 54 papers, most of it were games or experiments, but again, we chose those that were specific for fisheries and fishers, not students in the classroom. Information provision and education, so a lot of awareness raising interventions. Regulatory change and social marketing were not that much in common, only 9%. And participatory co-design approach, we also find monitoring interventions, market-based instruments, and voluntary approach. These were the least found. Effectiveness of the interventions, we've identified both social, economic, and environmental outcomes. And we didn't find a lot of environmental impacts in those papers. Most of it was unknown, but in proportion, there was higher social outcomes that were reported rather than environmental. From the policy recommendations that we've extracted from the papers, we found that 23 papers were on socioeconomic incentives and disincentives, then communication, education, and awareness, and then community management / co-management, and inclusiveness and transparency. These were the most prominent policy recommendations based on the behavioral economics interventions and mechanisms. Sorry, this was also only for the interventions. This was for the interventions, 54 papers. Research recommendations were also prevailing in the papers, mostly on methodological advances. So they recommended to use mixed methodology when you do behavioral economics research on fisheries. You need to also look at more target audiences rather than just fishers, for example, governmental fisheries behavior, and to make sure that your research design is robust and includes some important variables that you may not consider, such as social uncertainty, norm ambiguity, income, gender, religion, and social preferences. Behavior mechanism regulation interaction. It was not prominent, but it was one of the most common research recommendation to explore how behavioral mechanism change under different regulations. And of course, the effectiveness of intervention, which is very hard to measure, but there were also recommendations to do it for the long term. So for example, there was a paper that for a marine protected area in Mexico, they saw that there was a decrease in the fishing in the marine protected area 1 or 2 years after it was put in place. But since there was no control, then it kind of increased to the same levels of fishing again, even though the marine protected area was there. So paper protected area. So we need to look also at the intervention effectiveness in a temporal dynamics. Other recommendations were also on the interdisciplinarity of the team that is conducting the research, about long-term monitoring of interventions outcome, and of course the importance of control sites. Even if there are few, it was recommended to have at least one control site. So to wrap things up, if we look at the bigger picture and we go back to the IPBES transformative change framework that kind of updated the global assessment direct and indirect drivers, we can see that they've added underlying causes such as disconnection from and domination over nature and people. So that's more related to values and relational values that need to be enhanced. Concentration of power and wealth, that's more about power dynamics. And also they wrote prioritization of short-term individual and material gain. So what I would like to consider, and maybe have a brainstorm also afterwards in the discussion, is that I don't think they went far enough, and I will explain. First of all, the Nexus assessment that was published also last year, the Nexus assessment, they saw that in the values, you see that the scenarios which least benefits for marine sustainable fisheries were food first and nature over exploitation. So this is also related to values and short-term prioritization. So we need to prefer more scenarios that take into account nature nexus. But what I think is that we need to also consider the origins of why the prioritization of short-term individual and material gains are prominent. And we need to look more on what is really underlying this prioritization process, which is beliefs, belief biases, lack of belief updating, and the behavioral mechanisms, which I presented in both the Baltic Sea science paper and the systematic review of the behavioral mechanisms for fisheries. What IPBES transformative change assessment suggests is consistent with some of the results that I've identified here and presented. So inadequate policies and unfit institutions, unsustainable consumption and production pattern, and limited access to knowledge. These are some of the challenges for transformative change that we need to find a way to resolve. And yeah, this is the IPBES transformative change framework. But what it best highlights is also solutions. So I think we should also be focusing on perceived risks, understanding and measuring problem of fit, and ingrained practices and habits, which can be measured both through behavioral economics, but also through network approaches. And if anyone's interested in my paper on stakeholder network analysis, it will be published, hopefully, until the end of the month. And I can also send you in a PDF version. So to conclude, one of the things that I put in the discussion of my dissertation is that we need to look into the impact, but think about it in the longer term, and also consider the enabling factors and barriers, both on individual level, organizational level, and external level. So the pyramid should start at stakeholder needs, beliefs, and values, identifying them and seeing what is the status, then the knowledge generation and communication. So co-production of knowledge would go here as an enabling factor for strong and robust knowledge production. Then choosing the right solutions, which policy instruments, but also objectives. Policy implementation, both short and long term, that creates intermediate impact, and then we reach the final impact, and it needs to be adapted, monitored, and evaluated at every stage. So yeah, thank you so much. And I will now stop sharing, and I would love to hear some feedback and your thoughts about that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Noah. That was really fascinating. Great to see the connections as well to the big international policy processes that you've been connecting with towards the end of your talk. So we have about 12 or 13 minutes for questions. Please feel free to raise your hand using the little button on Zoom, or you can just unmute yourself and start talking if that's too complicated. Who would like to jump in with the first question or comment?
If there is no one, I can jump in.
Yeah, great.
It's very nice. Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's very interesting. And I've read the paper you sent us about these behavioral economics. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was interesting that, from analyzing what actually worked in changing fisher behavior, what was one approach that stands out most promising, let's say? And why do you think so few researchers are moving beyond just observing behavior to actually testing ways to change it?
So I would, first of all, thank you for the questions. It's really interesting, but I would first start with the last part of your question. I think the approaches should be to see what combinations of factors are the most prevailing, because even if you put a marine protected area in place, you still need to look at the enabling factors for it to function over a long term. So are there a control in place, which actually control was not allowed in the interventions, but also co-management or social norms that are involved in sustaining the behavior, which campaign of awareness is being used, and is it effective? So I would argue that we first need to rethink about what the intervention is and how we define the intervention. Is it just one thing, or is it a set of some policy instruments that are in combination should deliver the expected impact? So first of all, I think we need to better understand what combinations impact which behavior and cognitive behavioral mechanisms, so social norms, cognitive biases. So for example, there were papers that identified that in small communities, monetary punishments do not necessarily work because the social norms are much stronger. So if you would just use social norms, that would not necessarily work unless you have the right policy instrument and the right enforcement. So social norms may only work under specific conditions. So I think we need to, even in every project or every campaign that we're doing, we need to find ways, even if we don't have funds for it, we need to find ways to monitor it and better understand it and publish it so we can find it in the literature afterwards.
Thank you. There are some, I mean,
Yes.
Benazir, do you want to ask yourself, or do you want me to read it out? I guess if she sent it in the chat. Bena says, you said that there is less research on commercial vessels and bottom trawlers. Can this be related to the fact that there are sensitives and risks associated with this kind of research? Sometimes this industry can be criminal and have major political influence, but maybe that is where the problem and solution lies, engaging with commercial fishing industry and studying connection to politics and governance.
Yeah, I think it's really crucial that we study also commercial fisheries. For some researchers, it's more exotic to go to the communities, but there were very few studies that did commercial fisheries, and the ones that did highlighted the issue of organizational culture. So it's not just about the fishers, it's about the organizational culture that they're in and what the bosses tell them to do, and how we can also study that is very important. I'm not sure if it's a problem of corruption or because it's just not interesting enough for researchers because it's more difficult, or that it's being regulated under the RFMOs and people think that it's under control because they're being highly regulated more than specific communities of fishermen. So maybe that could be, but I'm not sure. We didn't find it.
There is another from Candice. Candice is asking, she's saying, thanks for the presentation. Very insightful. My question is based on the study in the part on tracking intervention outcomes. Why was there a high social outcome report rather than environmental?
That depends on the intervention design. I guess it was more easy also to study income of fishers rather than the environmental impact of the intervention that may be over a long term and there's a time lag. So you need also to come back and study it, and you need ecologists to do this, and maybe some of the behavioral economics experts are economists as well. So it's more easier for them to study the social and economical aspects, but I don't know. I really don't know.
I can see raised hand as well if you want to mute yourself. Yeah.
Sure. And thanks for the great talk. Yeah, I just want to continue on the question on commercial fleets. Where do you see a substantial role for behavioral economics there, because of the larger scale and the increased role of regulation and the money incentives over there? Do you see a significant potential for interventions or studies in this scale?
So we had some papers that were exploring fleet behavior on a fleet scale. So this could also be a way in, so not necessarily study the organizational culture of the commercial fisheries, but through a fleet scale. So are the fleet fishing in the right fishing, or they're doing illegal fishing? So there is some ways in through different aspects of the fleet, but also you can ask with fishers within the commercial fisheries for each boat. You can do these type of studies and see how the organizational culture impacts and to what level. So I do see a lot of potential for behavioral economics also for the commercial fleets. And from the study that I've been doing on stakeholder network analysis, I can definitely see that sometimes the fisher lobbyists are presenting one position that is not necessarily representative of the whole fishery fleet. So, for example, there might be a company that has both small and large-scale fishers that is part of the same producer organization. And it's not necessarily being represented equally for small scale and large scale. So, yeah. Does that answer your question?
I was aiming mostly into what might be impactful interventions in the level of commercial fishing. Do you see any of them research, or can you speculate what might work there in order to reduce the overfishing in places it happens?
Yeah, because there were so few studies, I can give you a gut feeling, but I cannot really answer. If you want, I can look into the data set and just identify the fleet level interventions and see what people studied. But again, that doesn't mean that this is the only thing that can be studied. We can design new experiments and look into social norms also within and between commercial fishery fleets. So I think it has a lot of potential, but this study does not necessarily identify it because there were not a lot of studies on that level.
Thank you. Let's have 3 more questions. First Barry, then Eva, then Arjun. And if Noah, if you're okay, I can share your email in the chat and people can contact you. Yeah, Barry, go.
Yes, thanks, Noah. Really great to hear from you and hear about your research. So yeah, I was kind of wondering how the decision-making process around fisheries gets influenced by like broader narratives that are going on in the region. And I guess this is where the Baltic is interesting. You have this kind of some prevailing narrative because of the Regional Seas Convention, because of EU policy, that things like nutrient inputs are reducing, water quality is improving, albeit slowly. So did you see any evidence that those kind of parallel policy narratives influence the decision-making around fishing? So I guess the logic would be like, well, the kind of environmental conditions improving, maybe we can take more risky fisheries-related decisions. Have you seen anything like that?
So my research focused specifically on the stakeholder network analysis with regards to the Baltic, and we didn't do a lot of narrative analysis there. However, I can say that trying to balance the different policy instruments is something that is a narrative. So the fishers are saying, well, our impact compared to the predators like the seals and the cormorants is nothing. But so just keep on fishing, or the fish are decreasing not because of overfishing, but because of other factors such as environmental, such as oxygen, such as temperature. So there are narratives that are going in, and it is being regulated by different policy instruments. So they're saying, okay, so we use more spawning closures, and this is how we protect, but we still keep the quota level, even if it's a bycatch quota. Because it cannot be targeted, but they still need to fish the flatfish. So the cod is getting caught in flatfish fisheries. So yeah, there is a huge politicization of predator control. So they want to try to shoot the cormorants. They're even considering in Sweden to reinstate the seal fur ban. To remove it and shoot the seals and create a market for shooting the seals. So they need to so it is actually something that is being discussed right now at the Baltic, which is for me, I think without evidence that there is high impact of seals and cormorants, I don't think this is a good policy decision to make. But yes, we can see politicization of policy instruments, and I can send you also some papers on that too.
Thank you. Eva?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation via Noah. I was very inspired by the previous comments and the discussion. Like I was like a co-author together with Noah on the paper on the systemic failure, but it got me thinking. Actually, also the previous intervention by Leah and Barry. Like no, I don't know. We also mentioned, that the fishers, although the catch, and the quotas are in principle but there, but they do not exhaust them exactly because they are so high, the total allowable catch, what they could in principle catch. But now that you framed it in a much broader picture, I was wondering, is there something, that, behavioral economics or this kind of approaches can disclose with reference to these interesting findings that, fishers could in principle catch more, but this didn't happen actually? Just out of curiosity, yes, because I was inspired by the previous discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva, and thank you for being here. It was great to work with you on the paper. I really like your question because I also started to think about it. For the Baltic, I feel that the answer is also related to institutional inertia and status quo bias. So the fishers want what they fish now, but we couldn't find the right evidence for it. So we need to do more analysis and perhaps find specific indicators for that about the disclosure. I think we also discussed while reviewing the results that we need to look at the profit that the fishers make and why they don't go out to catch more. It might be related to actual economics and not just behavioral economics. So the fuel costs versus the effort. But these are all things that we need to look into. The question is also in the Baltic is the reported catch versus the unreported catch, because we do know that there are illegal discards and there are infringements that are not being reported and are not being input into the models. So it depends to what extent and where there's more depleted fishery, then even smaller amount of discards has a larger impact. So we also need to really find the data for the unreported catch and the unreported discards somehow. Maybe with the control regulation that now fishers will be obligated to have cameras on board, we can know more.
Thank you. And I think we have a couple of minutes for the last question, Arjun.
Yes, thank you. That was a really interesting talk, and it was very interesting to see how these mental models play out in framing the question and answering it as well. So I was just wondering, do you have any recommendations on what has worked or what could work for these upstream actors, like governments that are in place?
Thank you. So the upstream actors was actually the focus of my main PhD papers, and we started to do stakeholder network analysis for those political elite players for communicational lobbying. So we didn't look at the vote buying and all the exchange of money, but we did look at how the information flows in the network. And then we also added a legislative bargaining model to show who has the power of decision making, and then you can see which stakeholder is more close to the decision making power, and then do these kind of model analysis. What we found is that the small scale fishers and the NGOs have a higher amount of communicational lobbying, so they do a lot more communicational lobbying, and they have more communicational power. However, we did find that the communication and lobbying was only 25% of the decision making of the political actors. So actually communication influences, but to a certain extent, so it can make the decisions a little bit better, but it actually depends on the initial beliefs of the decision makers and how these beliefs were formed and what policy instrument to use and to what extent and what will be the outcome of a higher quota. So that's the amount of risk taking. We need to figure out a way how to influence these initial beliefs. So communication and lobbying does not necessarily do the job. We need to find how to really transform the initial beliefs of the stakeholders, of how they consider their own interpretation as correct. So these are deeper behavioral mechanisms that we need to explore. And that links also to science communication and the relationship between society and yeah.
No, thank you. I'm going to have to cut you off because although the questions are coming and your answers are very interesting, we're also out of time. So yeah, I'd just like to thank you very much indeed for sharing your paper and your work with us this afternoon. Albina has kindly posted your email address into the chat. So if anybody wants to follow up with you there, then they certainly can. Albina, did you have anything else you wanted to say to wrap up?
No, I just want to thank you, and I will be posting this video record on our YouTube channel, I guess. So yeah, and I'll be sending it around. And thank you, Noah, again.
Perfect. And
Very
I hope
interesting.
everyone will join us next time we have one of these notes from the field with our alumni. Until then, thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye-bye,
Thank you so
guys.
much.
Thank you.
You.